I'm Cassandra Vet. I'm a PhD student at the Institute of Development Policy in Antwerp. And so together with my supervisor and co-supervisor, we wrote this chapter on unequal power relations and how they shape the distributive impact of transfer pricing reforms. And one of the interesting ways is that, well, I have more of a political science background, as well as, well, I also did development studies. My supervisor, Professor Dani Cassimon, has focused on development finance and so on. And Professor Anne van de Vijver, she's from the law faculty and focuses on international tax law and so on. So, which was interesting is that we're a very interdisciplinary team. And so we could also challenge each other's thoughts based on our own insights that we got from these different perspectives on the topic of global tax avoidance. And so the main idea of this chapter is mainly how power relations in global reforms or technical reforms, but that's in the field of transfer price and governance have a global effect. How these shape the distributive outcome. So it's widely known that there is a distributive bias in global tax governance. A lot of reforms are taking place, but at times the way that we see distributive injustices or imbalances produced is only in a way of being represented, while at the same time power relations work much deeper. And this is kind of something we try to show throughout this article by focusing on a very specific transfer pricing reform process. Well, I think first of all, on a topical matter, it talks about the governance of transfer pricing within multinationals, a pricing technique that is often used to minimize the profits to be paid and even used for profit shifting purposes. So in that way, it relates to everything that has to do with the provision of public services, because it's about the expansion of the tax base. But I think which is even more relevant or more to the speaks more to the main idea of this chapter is the global, the SDG that puts forward that developing countries should be better representative in global governance institutions. And of course, this is something we fully support, but when you put this idea forward, often it is thought of as this is how we will solve the legitimacy issues that are there in global governance regimes. And so I think we put a critical perspective on this SDG forward that it's not just the representation, having the seat at the table, but it's also about what is seen as appropriate kind of governance, what are important ideas, discourses, and what is the influence and especially the distributive effect of these. I think it's a little bit of both, but when starting the research for this, this chapter, we wanted to focus on a lot of different kind of power dynamics, relations, and so on. But one of the things that I found that is in the stakeholder discussions, because we compared different draft papers of the reform, that we used the recorded stakeholder discussions to see how these power relations actually are taking place and are observable. But in the stakeholder discussion, a very little contestation was observable and only about a few ideas. So that made us think a bit more on why is contestation maybe not taking place, even though the impact of these decisions are are very important when you talk about how you're going to distribute it, a recaptured tax base. You would expect some controversies or some pulling of both ways between countries and different groups. And this was actually less taking place because the discourse is very much technicized. So that's when we also decided to really look into the different ideas and which one is most contested, which one is the least, how would this be, and what's the impact. And then, of course, also in terms of those people taking place, is that the diversity of stakeholders in the discussions is relatively limited. So you have the industry representatives, you have a lot of people from the tax advisory industry, but the kind of discourses allowed and the stakeholders present are limited. So of course this shapes the outcomes as well. I think mostly that when we talk about legitimacy and inclusiveness, that you go beyond the issue of representation. So I think we could, for instance, compare this to the kind of talks that are going on decolonization and diversity, where they say, well, when you talk about just diversity, you don't address the unequal power relations or imbalances that are there. And I think in that kind of way, when you want to make global governance regimes more inclusive and more legitimate to developing countries, that you should do more than just say, well, we'll make sure that they have a seat at the table and they can participate in the rules that we decide upon, but also to look upon the ideas, what is their historical context. Maybe they're mostly based on this orthodox economic thoughts of a very specific region, and we kind of expect other countries to join in to this discussion, but in the kind of language, in the kind of ideas that is already there. So to look beyond that and actually, try to deconstruct these ideas, what they mean, and the discourses there, and maybe open them up as well to allow for more contestation.